Years ago, I got to be in the room while John Fields produced and engineered the second Jonas Brothers record, and the record ended up being mixed by Chris Lord-Alge. So I drove to the mall to buy the album the day it came out. I was excited to hear all the crazy magic that he did, and see how big of a difference there was between the raw tracks and the final mix. I remember putting that CD in my car stereo, and I was flabbergasted by...
Cut! You can't say the word flabbergasted, I told you.
What?
Think of another.
And I was amazed by what I heard, but not for the reasons you'd think. The mix itself didn't blow me away, even though it was classic CLA. What shocked me was how close it sounded to the raw tracks. The drums sounded pretty much the same as I heard them a few months earlier. It didn't even sound like samples were added. The bass and guitar tones, unchanged. In fact, it sounded like I was right back in the control room, hearing those songs during the tracking stage, just with some added impact, punch, and polish. Like most amateur engineers, especially in the rock world, I was used to doing all the heavy lifting in the mix, completely replacing kick, snare, and tom sounds, reshaping guitar tones, and trying to make my tracks sound like someone else's mix. The fix it in the mix problem has gotten even worse today. Since anyone in their bedroom can do it, there's been an explosion of mix tutorials online. And since 90% of the content out there is mixing related, most people are focusing 90% of their efforts in the mix. You know what I mean? Mixing headaches and mixing questions dominate the discussion. But the thing is, most aspiring engineers don't actually have mixing problems. Over the years, I've reviewed a lot of mixes for my premium course members, and 80% of the time, the mix is actually pretty good. My feedback ends up being about things like guitar tuning, sloppy drum performances, pitchy vocals, and obvious mistakes. In those cases, simply plugging better performances into the exact same mix would instantly sound 10 times better. Look, I get it. Tracking sessions can seem hit or miss at the best of times, and a lot of people simply try to rush through tracking so that the band can finally go home and they can tweak everything and try to fix it in the mix. Think about all the questions going through an engineer's mind just during guitar tracking. Which amp and cab are right for the song? And what's the right mic and placement? How do you know when to commit to a tone and whether it will actually work in the final mix? What should it sound like before mixing? And then, if you actually get a tone you think is good, getting the right take is a whole other ballgame. What if the player's sloppy and noisy? What if they can't even play their parts? It's understandable that most engineers cling to the comforting thought that it's easier to fix or change things later than it is to commit during recording. But the day I heard that Chris Lord-Alge mix, the truth was clear. The best mixes sounded great before they were mixed at all. Many of my Pro Production System members have had this epiphany and are now committed to getting it right at the source with game-changing results. Now, I bet you probably agree with me, at least in theory, that getting the best source tracks possible is one of the keys to a great mix. So what's stopping people from getting great tones and great takes, even though they know this is essential? The answer is a whole lot of BS that engineers think they need. Ever seen stuff like this? When I see 4 mics on a cab or someone blending 3 vocal mics on a singer, it's a dead giveaway. This engineer probably doesn't know what they're doing. And these overcomplicated techniques are not about getting the best sound, they're mostly about recording 4 mics as a safety net, just hoping that one of them or a blend will work in the mix, because you don't actually know what you're looking for. And hey, if you're unsure of yourself during a tracking session, what better way to look smart than having a fancy mic configuration? Whether it's complicated multi-mic techniques, stacking layer after layer of guitars, or getting the musician to do 6 takes of everything so that you can comp it later, the same equation is at play. A lack of skill and knowledge leads to a lack of confidence, which leads to a lack of commitment and delaying all decisions until later. No wonder people get frustrated and depressed with their mixes and can't seem to finish a project. But what if it didn't have to be like that? What if it was simple? Imagine knowing exactly which mic to use and where to put it, and then quickly dialing in a tone that you know will work in the final mix. Even with drums, arguably the hardest instrument to mic up, what if you had a go-to strategy that simply sounded great for every drummer on every project? Remember, we're here to make good music, not to nerd out over gear. So if you want to start getting raw tracks that sound better than your current final mixes, there are 4 key ingredients. First, you need to master the fundamentals of the instruments themselves. That means being able to choose the right drum sizes and cymbals and guitars, strings and amps that fit the vision for the record. If the band wants a fat Paramore snare sound, don't let the drummer use his 13x3 piccolo no matter how much he loves it. And if they tune down to drop B, those extra light slinky strings are not an option. The unfortunate truth is that many musicians you work with won't know how to tune their drums or intonate their guitars. This is why it's essential that you can step in and help. You can learn the basics to tuning a drum and learn how to properly string and set up a guitar. Even though you might have thought that your job was just to plug in mics and move faders, mastering these instrument fundamentals will make a massive difference in your source tracks. Now, the second ingredient you need is fast go-to miking strategies that work every time. But why reinvent the wheel, trying different mic combos and overhead configurations every time? Do you really need 3 mics on a metal kick drum? Do you need to run a shootout every single time? This isn't rocket science. There are proven, simple ways to mic a drum kit or guitar amp that will sound good on every project. And you don't have to be nervous about what will come out of the speakers as you walk back to the control room. Focusing on simple mic techniques until you can nail it every time with little or no tweaking is essential to making good records fast. Third, you need to commit to sounds, and that means not settling. This might surprise you, but my goal when recording guitars is to get a tone that needs no EQ in the mix. And it's entirely possible. The mindset is simple. If it doesn't sound 80% like a finished record right there during tracking, then it's not good enough yet. Keep going until you get the right tone. Fourth, and probably most important, is the ability to solve performance problems. You can do everything else right. You can be the best mixer in the world, but if you've got sketchy tuning and sloppy playing, it will never, ever sound pro. And again, this is not something that you can put off and try to fix later. Pro engineers will do whatever it takes to get the tightest performance possible, because we know that size, power, and impact doesn't come from stacking a bunch of layers or using the fanciest gear. It comes from everything being tight, in tune, and hitting all at the same time. That's why inside the Pro Production System, I show you every step and teach you all of these skills, from replacing heads and tuning drums, string choices and intonation for guitar and bass, go-to mics and positions for every instrument, and the workflow and workarounds to get great sounding takes out of drummers and guitarists, even when they struggle to play what they wrote. And having a small room is no excuse. I made all of my important records in a tiny 300 square foot live room, and the PPS reveals exactly how to get a tightly controlled drum sound and great sounding room tracks, even in a small space. Now this might seem daunting, and I'll be honest, it does take longer to track with the bar set this high. But on the other hand, it saves hours of editing and days of mixing. Even better, your clients will love it. You can actually have their songs sounding like a real record the whole time they're tracking it. That means far less mix notes and clients who don't even think about going to someone else. And before you start thinking that good source tracks depend on expensive gear, let me tell you, I wasted thousands of dollars buying and selling boutique mics and preamps throughout the years. When I finally understood what really makes good records, I sold most of it off and just kept what worked, with most of my mics costing just a few $100 or less. So by now you see that a pro sounding record all starts, well, at the start. And if you haven't been approaching your tracking sessions with this level of detail, you now know where the biggest opportunity for improvement in your mixes actually is. The fastest way to level up your recordings is not to get fancier gear or fancier engineering knowledge, it's to raise the floor of what you deem to be acceptable takes and tones. Now, even if you do everything right at the tracking stage, sometimes even the best musicians need a little help from editing, especially if you want your drums and vocals to live up to modern standards. And luckily, in the next episode, you're about to see just how crucial editing can be, and why it doesn't have to be as boring, painful, tedious, or scary as you might think. In the raw tracks and final mix, I remember putting my... And I was flabbergasted by what...
Cut. You can't say flabbergasted. You've got to find a different word.
I remember putting that CD in my car stereo, and I was flabbergasted by what I heard.
Dude, you can't say flabbergasted.
It tuned down to drop B. Those extra light slinky slings are not an option. Did I say slings? Oh, I'm so glad you caught that. And if they tune down to drop B, these extra light slinky strings are not an option.
You held them upside down.
And having a small room, or no light.
Did you know that some bands suck at playing their instruments?